Okay, thanks, Terry. So the topic of my discussion then is investments in wildlife conservation. I've done different versions of this depending on what the theme of any given presentation was, but it made a lot of sense for this, Restoring the West Conference and Balancing Energy Development with Biodiversity. The times are changing. In my industry specifically, I would say in any development organization out on public lands and even on private lands. For us, in my industry, the energy industry, the easy oil and gas is gone. Anywhere we are finding oil and gas or exploring for oil and gas these days, there are conflicts that we have to deal with. We're harder and harder to get to locations. Lots of different resources that cause those conflicts. Lots of regulations continually increasing. Nearby neighbors. What that means to us is a lot of pre-project planning. That's sort of the theme of this, is looking at these issues and looking at these conflicts before the project's anywhere close to being on the ground. You'll hear probably similar stories from Brook Bell tomorrow at Anadarko, but lots of upfront planning. What that allows the folks that represent those other resources, probably some of the folks in this room, is that opportunity to get in early, whether it's a NEPA situation on public lands, even if it's on private lands, to get in and talk to those operators, coordinate, talk to the agencies, et cetera, and discuss those resources and those potential conflicts up front. What it means for us is we need to utilize a lot of low impact methods. Technology's changed a bunch over the last few years. 5 years ago, not a whole lot of horizontal drilling was being done. Now we're revitalizing oil and gas fields that have been in existence for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So things like 3D seismic allows us to drill less dry holes, so less impact that way. Directional drilling, we can do multi-well pads, drill a bunch of wells from a single pad depending on the geology. Centralized facilities, maybe we've got a drill rig in one location, but because of some conflicts with wildlife or other resources, maybe we put the facilities, the tank battery, the production separator, in another location that's less of a conflict. So a number of the planning issues. Location, of course, one of the main ones. Is the location in a conflict area? Can we move that location? We have some flexibility depending on the topography, depending on the geology, how deep the resource is that we're going after, as to how far we can move that surface location from where the bottom hole is or where we're getting that oil or natural gas. Multiple well pads we talked about in the directional drilling. Roads and access routes and pipelines, always a big issue. Flexibility there as well, and things, that kind of thing being discussed in the upfront planning. Viewshed issues, siting of locations, type of equipment, etc. Noise, always an issue, whether it's wildlife or neighbors in an urban situation. Traffic, obviously, wildlife, always a big concern. In Colorado, we operate in the DJ Basin, which is mostly an urban sort of situation. So dust, safety, all those kinds of things. Wildlife, of course, what we're here to talk about today, and lots of other potential resources. We deal a lot with cultural things, recreation, paleo. There's an endless list there depending on where you end up with your resource play. Resource diversity versus energy development. Again, welcome to the neighborhood. In that Denver area that I'm talking about, my neighbors are literally folks like you and I. Here in Utah where we operate, it's mostly wildlife type issues. We do have archaeology issues and others, but for today we'll discuss the wildlife. But lots of potential conflicts out there. Agricultural, ranchers, recreation, including hikers that want serenity, OHV riders that want access, that sort of thing. Wildlife, maybe including T&E species. Residents, owners, sometimes it's tenants and not owners, which is a different situation. Hunters, of course. Sometimes they want access, sometimes they don't want us around, so there's a give and take there even on the hunter situation. Wilderness areas, obviously we conflict with that, and again, others that aren't listed here. Wildlife planning issues. 3 of the main ones that we're dealing with in Utah are big game, both elk and mule deer. The hookless cactus is important to us, and most recently the sage grouse. That's actually a picture of me with a collared sage grouse there. That's Brad Crompton from the DWR. A month or so ago, we were out in West Havaputs and up till 3 in the morning and not drinking beer, as I was telling somebody earlier, and caught one sage grouse, but it was pretty fun, and collared it and released it. Down here, picture of sage grouse actually on one of our tank batteries in the West Havaputs area as well, and I've got another picture of that. But lots of planning issues. Just generally, does the project need to change? When we first started our West Havaputs, and I'll get into that example in a little bit, the scope of it was one size. When we ended up finaling it and getting final approval, it was a completely different size. And a number of things came to play there. Part of it, technology changes, what we were able to do. Also, a lot of this discussion caused that to happen, this pre-planning project discussion. Things like timing restrictions, no surface occupancy areas, whether it's a lek or something like that, a wildlife a sensitive area, or restricted areas. Access, I'll talk about some road issues later. Habitat improvements, what can be done to make the habitat for wildlife better? We can help, I guess, is what I'm trying to promote here. We understand the need to coexist, but the guys in the corner offices, at my office as we like to call them, are businessmen. And while they understand that need to coexist, they also have to have a viable business. So, we've got to produce oil and gas. But while I wouldn't say every company necessarily works that way, I would say most of them do. And at least these days, and they're willing to listen, they're willing to put money on the ground, they're willing to work with folks, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. We can bring resources to the table. We have equipment, we have financial resources. When we're talking about big projects, there's a lot of money involved, so putting money on the ground to avoid some of those conflicts or mitigate some of those conflicts is well worth it, even to the businessmen at my office. And the new technologies, as I mentioned, allow a lot more flexibility than we've had in the past, in a number of different ways. So what works? Getting in and talking early and often. Not voting early and often, but talking early and often. If it's a public land situation, obviously, get with the agencies. You can certainly contact the oil and gas company. But there's lots of guaranteed options for getting input when we're talking about public lands. But I would propose to you that even on private lands, most operators are willing to listen to practical information. If you come in and you start ranting and raving about, we don't want you, get the hell out, that's not going to go a long ways. But if you come in and say, here's the issue I have, here's what I think might work, or let's talk about what might work, I think you'll have a lot of luck working with oil and gas companies in that situation. We prefer to work with legitimate conservation groups and wildlife agencies. I'm hoping all the wildlife agencies are legitimate, by the way. With on-the-ground projects, real things that we can point to, whether it's collaring sage grouse and monitoring those, paying for collars, that sort of thing, doing habitat enhancement projects, that sort of thing. It's easier for us to point to those things and feel good about that we've done something actually on the ground versus a lot of studies, although we understand the importance of studies too and the importance of science, and I'll mention that later as well. Third bullet, litigation does not conserve plants or animals. I think we all know that. The animals don't know the difference if all we're doing is litigating. If we're doing on-the-ground projects, they do know the difference. So this pre-planning is essential. Work with those agencies, better yet work with us together. The Havaputs project that I'm going to talk about is a good example of where I think that worked very well. West Havaputs Development Environmental Impact Study. We can have both. We can have the energy development, we can have wildlife populations that are thriving. In 2004, we basically sat down with the BLM as well as the DWR out of Price and said, we understand wildlife's a big issue. We had other issues on that project, don't get me wrong. Wilderness, archaeology, huge issues. But for today, we're just going to talk about the wildlife. And we came to them long before we even put out our proposal, our scope of work, and said, we want to come up with a wildlife mitigation plan, and we want to voluntarily put that into our project. Yes, we probably knew that we had to do that at some point anyways, but we came in early, sat down with the biologist and said, what are the issues? You know, here's generally what we're looking at. It was a conceptual EIS, so we didn't have specific locations for all of our wells, but we had a general idea of where stuff was going to be. We knew there was sage-grouse habitat up there, mule deer, elk, etc. So sat down with those folks, sat down with some of the conservation groups. Some of those folks are here today. We looked at those sensitive wildlife areas, as I mentioned, sage-grouse, mule deer, and elk. And the final product from that was a wildlife mitigation plan with a oversight committee, and we meet annually at a minimum. I think we're going to start meeting twice annually after our last meeting, and basically discuss the issues. So we agreed to a certain amount of mitigation depending on the amount of disturbance that we created. We then sit down with this committee, which includes DWR, BLM, local conservation groups, the county folks, and others, and say, what are the issues? You know, lately it's all been sage-grouse, but as you can imagine, doing things for sage-grouse habitat helps the elk and the mule deer habitat as well, typically. So not a lot of conflicts there, but that's how the process has worked. So on the ground, these are just some of the things we have done there. Annually, we've been help pay for the sage-grouse collaring and monitoring, mapping of where these sage-grouse go. Very interesting project. I'll show you a quick example that several of you that know me have heard before, but it's a funny story about adaptive management. Habitat mapping, we've done for sage-grouse, we've done a project with a group for that. Habitat improvements, we've done a couple of projects there. Controlled burns, we've done a road closure and realignment on 2 mesas, and I'll show you a picture of that. Pinyon juniper removal is a lot of our habitat treatment there, and then we're also going to try some experimental seeding as well. This is a map of the project area. That's the Carbon County line right there. Price, Utah over here, Vernal up this direction. Green River right there, just to give you an idea where we're at. This is just a quick picture of some of the road realignment closure that we do. Part of it's seasonally and part of it's permanent. We close some roads seasonally and use alternative roads. We've also closed some roads and built new roads out of the sage-grouse habitat, in this case, to avoid that. This is the funny story I was going to mention under the adaptive management, is that we closed, I think it's this road in here, during seasonal times, and we're able to monitor the sage-grouse based on those radio collars that we had on them. And interestingly enough, the sage-grouse moved after we closed that road to the active road. So when people tell you they know all about sage-grouse or mule deer or elk, think of that story and say, you probably don't know all about them. But what that says to me is not so much that we don't have science or that science is no good. It just says we don't know everything, and we have to be flexible. We can't have a plan so rigid that says, well, sorry, we're not going to change that even though the animals didn't do what we thought they were going to do. So a real good example of promoting that sort of adaptive management scenario. This is just a map of an upcoming sage-grouse habitat manipulation project that we've got up on the Peters Point Mesa there, the far east side of that project area. I don't even know how many acres we're talking about here, but removing pinyon juniper and then doing some seeding work there as well. As part of that, we're doing some experimental seeding on road strips that we're reclaiming, both for a fire break, because fire is a big issue with any of the wildlife up there, but as well as to just see if we can sort of grow, as Terry and the term I've learned, grow some green groceries for the animals up there. I was going to say the folks up there, for the animals up there, and see if we can monitor any changes in use of the area because of those green grocery strips, I guess you would call them. So we're going to actually over-reclaim some roads to make a pretty big strip there and try some experimental seeding there. This is a project in Colorado that we contributed to and worked with the Colorado Mule Deer Association, also the Department of Wildlife, CDOW. I think they're now called Parks and Wildlife in Colorado. It's in western Colorado on the western slope, the Molina Habitat Restoration Initiative. basically working with landowners to create, to open up migratory corridors for mule deer for the most part, but also, again, in doing that, helping sage grouse and helping elk in the area as well. Worked together with those folks to offset damage claims. We did the pinyon juniper removal and destruction, and then also did seeding projects. Got kids involved in doing the seeding projects, and as part of the deal, the kids that came out and did the seeding projects got an education and then got hunting access on these private lands as well. So it was a really cool project, working with a lot of different groups to, you know, obviously initially help the wildlife, but promoting access, education, new seeding projects, a really cool project that we're pretty proud of. We're pretty results oriented. We're a bunch of scientists. I'm a geologist. I do all this biology discussion, but I'm really a geologist. We've got engineers, we've got businessmen. You know, we're results oriented. Again, as I mentioned before, on the ground, nearby the project if possible, but it's not essential. If the real work or the real habitat is adjacent to a project and that's where the most benefit comes, we're fine with that. That's where we look to the agencies and the conservation groups to tell us, geologists and engineers and businessmen, what makes the most sense. Sure, we'd love to have it in our project area, but again, if it makes sense off that area and we get better benefit for the animals overall, then we're fine with that kind of thing. Again, habitat manipulation, invasives removal, these are just some examples of the kind of things that we do. Seeding, experimental seeding in some cases, as I mentioned, but just reseeding in some cases. Water projects are always desirable. And we do understand the need for science. So sometimes it's not really an on-the-ground project. You know, the collaring and monitoring is sort of that, but, you know, mapping habitat, watching what animals do. If funding that makes the most sense to the conservation groups and the agencies, typically we're going to say we're fine with that. You tell us where it makes best sense to spend those dollars, and you get the most bang for the buck there. This is just a quote from, that's a shot from western slope of Colorado in the Piceance Basin, but this is a quote from Ron Velarde, who's the Northwest Regional Manager of the Division of Wildlife, and he was basically talking about that Molina project that we did, but he said, we can't do this work alone. It's critically important to have conservation groups and private corporations step forward to make sure those wildlife populations have good habitat to not just survive, but to thrive. And without this kind of leadership, these herds would face an uncertain future. I think what he's saying there, what I take away from that is, you know, these agencies have limited resources, and if we're going to have energy development, that brings financial resources and, like I mentioned, equipment and sometimes personnel resources as well, depending on what you're ended up doing out there, to the table. So let's take advantage of that. Let's utilize that. Otherwise, again, not necessarily the litigation scenario that I mentioned, but doing nothing sometimes isn't any good either. So let's try to make a positive impact out there while at the same time keeping the businessmen happy in those corner offices and extracting the energy resources. So the old days and the old ways are gone. Again, I use the same discussion when I'm talking to the urban crowd about how we have to do things in an urban situation. Just different conflicts or different resources, being human resources versus wildlife that we're talking about here. So again, we need that intensive pre-project and operational planning with not only with the agencies, but with those groups and or individuals that have concerns out there. So again, tell us what the issues are, come to us with practical ideas or at least practical thoughts to get that sort of discussion started. Again, ranting and raving is not going to get our interest up or keep our interest, I should say, but if you come in and say, here's a real issue, here's, you know, I know what you need to do, what can we do to change this to get to this end point? That's the kind of discussion that we're happy to have. I'm typically the guy having that. We're a fairly small company. There are companies like you'll hear from Anadarko that has, you know, a floor of these kind of people. We have 2 or 3 at my office, but it's the same deal. Those companies are typically willing to sit down and listen to reasonable folks talk about reasonable ideas that make a lot of sense. Again, just reiterating, utilizing low impact methods. Again, 3D seismic really helps us. It's pretty low impact doing the seismic, but what that does for us is allows us not to make those locations and drill dry holes and create that disturbance that doesn't create any energy either. I mean, it still happens, but it reduces that chance of that happening. So very important to get things like seismic done in a new area especially. Directional drilling, huge changes in the last 5 years, as I mentioned earlier. You know, in some places, they're drilling 2+ miles horizontal, which is a little different than directional. A true directional well goes vertically, cuts over a certain amount horizontally, and then drills vertically through the formation. When you're hearing this horizontal shale wells, typically it's vertical and then horizontal through the formation and producing horizontally, which is different than a directional well. But again, you can't do all of these things in every situation is the other piece of this puzzle. Just because we can, in a certain area, drill directionally, say 2,500 feet, depending on the depth to that pay zone, in another area we might not be able to go that far. We might only be able to go 800 feet or 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet. Same with horizontal wells as well. It just depends on the geology, your depth of that formation, the thickness of that formation. So there's a lot of factors. So just so you heard, some horizontal well in wherever, eastern Colorado went, you know, 2 miles horizontally. So why can't you drill that project from 2 miles away? It doesn't always work that way. It depends on the play that we're after. But those are the kind of things we can look at. So whether they all work in every area or not, they're all available to discuss and see what we can use. Low profile equipment, that's just things like tanks, etc. If you've got a visual issue and we can put in lower profile equipment, that's usually an easy one for most oil and gas companies to say, sure, we can do that kind of thing. Pitless mud systems, if there's concerns about having mud pits out there, whether it's wildlife or otherwise, it can be done in most situations, not all, but in most situations. Again, we talked about centralized facilities, whether that's water management, whether that's those tank batteries, things like compression. If we have to have compression out in the field, that can typically be centralized as well to avoid a certain sensitive area. We might have to drill a pad in that sensitive area, but we might be able to put the centralized facilities elsewhere to avoid that conflict. The adaptive management, I think, is just a huge issue. Don't write yourself into a corner. Don't write a plan that paints you into a corner, whether it's wildlife or anything else, but especially wildlife. We certainly don't know what humans are going to do either, but my example of the sage grouse, I think, is just a perfect picture for promoting that adaptive management thing. It's a term you hear a lot. I think it's very important that you just leave yourself enough room in there so that you can make changes as those animals make changes. And then, did you consider all these issues? Again, cultural, viewshed, wildlife to this crowd here. A lot of these overlap. Access certainly involves wildlife. Noise certainly involves wildlife. Water availability and disposal could do the same thing. So, in a nutshell, that's basically where we're at. So every project that I get involved in, there's a whole bunch of upfront planning, and it just depends on those resources that are out there, whether it's human, whether it's wildlife, whether it's cultural, you name it. That's the first thing my group looks at if we go into a new area. What are the issues that are out there? So if you hear of folks that are buying leases or looking at an area, or maybe they're even doing seismic at that point, and you know of conflicts or potential conflicts in that area, that's the time to get involved. Once we're out there drilling, if we haven't heard about those issues, because again, you know, if I don't get that information, the guys in the corner offices aren't going to know that. We sort of need your help in some ways, and sometimes getting us that information. And the sooner we get that information, the more ability we have to make adjustments to that plan, to talk about mitigation where we can't make adjustments, that sort of thing. So I think that's the message I'm trying to get across, is there is availability out there for folks like the folks in this room to talk to us, the companies, talk to the agencies, get everybody in the room and have those discussions and have some impact on a project. There is flexibility out there, not always, not on every location, not for every specific issue, but in general, we have ways that we can manipulate these projects to at least lessen the impact, if not completely avoid it. And that's all I've got for you today. There's another picture of those sage grouse on the tank battery. That's a flare pit at the well site there. They tend to like that bare soil sometimes. That's all I've got. Any questions? Okay, so the question was, in working with the different wildlife agencies, probably in different states and or in different regions of states, I guess you're asking, Bill, what are the differences between those offices or agencies, if there are differences? I always use the example of the BLM, and I don't know if any BLM folks are here, but the BLM example, and there, of course, are wildlife folks at the BLM offices as well, so it still speaks to your question. There are clear differences between offices, and it's something that we find frustrating because you've got, this set of federal regulations and or state regulations in the case of the state agencies, and one would hope that that's pretty black and white, but it's not. It really depends on the folks there, and I think the same in the state agencies and the wildlife agencies across the state, but for the most part, this kind of thing, we've had very receptive audiences. It's also becoming a little more commonplace now, but when we started in 2004, you remember, I don't think a lot of companies were coming to you. I'm not patting myself too much on the back here, I hope, but I don't think a lot of companies were coming to the agencies and saying, we want to do a wildlife mitigation plan. I think you guys were saying, you need to do a wildlife mitigation plan. But so for the most part, yeah, very receptive to this. There are always going to be some individuals, it's the same in the oil and gas companies. There are some dinosaurs in my office. And there are probably some dinosaurs in some agencies out there too that are just set in a certain way that they've done things, and it's more difficult to get things done there. But in general, Bill, to answer your question, yeah, it's been very receptive. And while there's differences, it's been very good on this sort of thing from my point of view anyways. Good question. I guess my answer, the question was, what from the energy company side, what can be done? I think that's basically what I was presenting here is what I would just reiterate is that, having those conversations, maybe it's USGS says, there's a bunch of paleo issues out there. Well, I didn't know that. And to know that way up front would be very helpful for me because I got a bunch of geologists that are working on the petroleum side who are putting dots on a map, who don't know where those lecks are for the sage-grouse, don't know where the paleo resources are, et cetera. So, and they don't care when they're looking at a white piece of paper. They're just putting dots where the oil and gas is. I need to have the information to come to them and say, okay, draw in circles on a map or lines or whatever it might be and say, here's some sensitive issues out there, what can we do? Now maybe we can't do anything and we have to mitigate, but maybe we can adjust locations, etc. In the case of paleo, we typically set up monitors to inspect during the excavations, those sort of things. If we know where the sensitive wildlife habitats are, again, we can adjust some locations, we can adjust some access. We do daily timing restrictions, whether it's sage grouse or otherwise. We do seasonal restrictions, all that kind of stuff. But for me to get to those geologists, when they're putting those dots on a map is the time to do it, because once we've sort of, as that gets further down the path, it gets more set in stone, no pun intended, and it's tougher to change those things. When they're just putting dots on a map, I have a lot more flexibility to say, what can we do? And sometimes it's those dinosaurs I got to deal with who are like, you know what, tell them to do, with their resource conflict out there, and that's my job is to say, well, we don't get to tell them that. So, what can we do? And again, most of the folks are fairly progressive that we have that sort of ability and flexibility to do some things. So, thank you.